Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. So the NFL Draft Combine is underway in Indianapolis, so just wanted to do a little Browns Combine preview, go through, what I'm looking out for, what position groups I've got my eyes on, and, a couple of players as well. I did originally want to do a slightly more in-depth dive into some of these guys, but I'll be honest, I've been so busy with work and currently moving and wanted to get this out obviously before the festivities truly get started on Thursday. So I will do a more in-depth dive into these prospects as part of my draft content leading up to April. But for now, let's talk about some NFL Draft Combine. I must admit, as a British fan, the Combine took some getting used to all those years ago. There's no equivalency in British sports, so it's a completely foreign concept for a lot of British fans that are getting into it. It's of course a great resource to get insight to a majority of the NFL draft prospects each year, and provides an invaluable information that teams use to scout players. The Browns in particular put a lot of stock into the Combine. That's shown through their willingness to be present for most of the festivities, as well as their tendency to draft players with above average RAS scores. If you aren't aware, a RAS score, RAS, is relative athletic score. It's essentially a formula that uses data from the Combine to calculate where a prospect scores in athletic ability against all other players at their position, both past and present. The Browns usually keep to trend when it comes to drafting players with above average RAS scores more often than not. I will admit, the Combine can be a bit gross at times. It can sometimes be forgotten that, these are human beings and that we're hyperfixating on their physical measurements and, just reducing them to essentially a number, as well as a just constant character assessment and, stories about how they got a parking ticket 4 years ago. I love the NFL draft and, the Combine plays a huge role in it, but I do just try my best to avoid all the unnecessary gibberish that, we always get from it each year. But moving on to this year's Combine, let's start with, the guys that won't be participating in any drills down in Indy this week. First and foremost, Abdul Carter, still recovering from the shoulder injury that he suffered in the Fiesta Bowl. He will partake in his physical exams and interviews, but obviously won't be taking part in the drills. No need for him to compete on any of the drills. The tape speaks for itself. He's the best player in the draft, in my opinion. Shedeur Sanders, very interesting one for the Browns for a lot of people. He will not be partaking in drills, but again will be doing his physical exams and interviews. Probably the smart move from Shedeur. We know what kind of quarterback he is. No need to go out there and throw nets to a guy like Jalen Milroe, who will just make his arm look pretty weak and cause a stir on social media. It's not an explosive arm, but it's good enough for the NFL. Understandable why Shedeur is skipping the drills. A lot of the top QBs do every year. And speaking of Cam Ward, as of recording, it's still not been reported whether he will be participating in drills, which I imagine it probably leans towards it. The fact being that he's going to be skipping the drills as well, because he's probably already heard enough from teams to know that he's more than likely to go top 5. So what's the point? What's the point risking injury with the drills? Ashton Jeanty will also only participate in physical exams and interviews. Again, it makes sense. He'll be the first running back off the board regardless. He knows he's going in the first round. No need to risk hurting yourself. There's also been some criticisms of his size, so the testing and all of that would only just add fuel to that fire. So it makes sense on his part. So in regards to the guys actually participating in the Combine this year, let's go through what position groups and a few players I'll be keeping my eyes on at this year's Combine, as it relates, of course, to the Browns' needs and what I think they will be targeting. Let's start with the obvious one, the quarterbacks. Obviously, with the consensus top two guys in Shadur Sanders and Cam Ward not participating in drills, there might not be quite as much intrigue for the quarterbacks this weekend. However, on the flip side, it does provide a great opportunity for that next tier of guys to improve their stock. They'll be on display, during the primetime Saturday slot as always, so a great chance for them. First and foremost, what you might consider my guilty pleasure of a draft prospect, shall we say, Jalen Milroe. I'm still intrigued. I'm really interested to see how he tests. In regards to the drills, of course, want to see way better accuracy than we saw at the Senior Bowl. We know he's got a howitzer of an arm. He's got to light up the top speed, the throw speed test, but he needs to show, better accuracy with the football. I don't necessarily think he's, a glaringly inaccurate quarterback. This isn't a Josh Allen 2018 situation. He was accurate enough in college, but after the Senior Bowl, it would be good to see him, shore up some of those doubts. And whilst throwing to receivers, running routes on air isn't really a great reflection of accuracy. We just don't want to see him, skipping balls off the ground like we saw at the Senior Bowl. In regards to his athletic testing, this is where the intrigue really grows. The kid is electric. He'll probably run a 4.4 40. If he does decide to run it, that is. If he can go out there and show his athletic ability in the drills, and show that he will be one of the better athletes, at the quarterback position in the NFL already, then he'll solidify himself as at least a second round pick, in my opinion. You just can't teach game-breaking athleticism and speed at the quarterback position. It will be good to get further clarity on his physical measurements because, he's not the biggest quarterback and his hand size measured out pretty small at the Senior Bowl. He did have 9 fumbles this past season, but to be honest, he didn't actually have that many fumbles in the previous 2 seasons. So it didn't seem to be a trend. So, but the hand size criticisms will persist regardless. But, as long as he hasn't lost a foot in height since the Senior Bowl and comes in around 220, then I think any criticisms of his physical traits will just end at his hand size. Fun prospect, fun guy. Looking forward to seeing what Milroe can do at the Combine this weekend. Will Howard, call it Ohio State bias, but I think there's a player in there. I really do. Don't get me wrong. It might be as a career backup, but, for where he'll probably get drafted, I'd be willing to take that swing if I was a GM. He's got the traditional quarterback build and frame. He's a big guy. Ohio State used him in plenty of short yardage situations, and he was able to pick up first downs easily. He's not going to wow you with his arm talent, but he's accurate enough and he does throw with good anticipation. I think he could do a lot this weekend to boost himself, into that day 2 discussion. I will, of course, be rooting, for the national championship, winning Buckeye regardless. I'll, of course, also be keeping my eyes on guys like Jackson Dart, Quinn Ewers, and Riley Leonard. But I'll be honest, I'm so down on this year's, quarterback class that I'd be scraping at the barrel if I sat here and tried to praise these guys. Maybe one of these guys can light up the Combine and get themselves into the back end of the first round, but I doubt it. Moving on to running backs. If you're a subscriber of mine, you'll know this. I've spoken all off-season about how it's one of the Browns' biggest needs. They really need to invest into their run game, especially with, the offense expected to go back to a more West Coast scheme. You can't rely on play action if you can't run the ball. As simple as that. Something the Browns haven't been able to do well for 2 years now. They've not been able to run the ball. We know Stefanski can put together a very good run game. The proof is in the pudding. Just had so many injuries in that room the last few years on top of, really poor offensive line play. With the Nick Chubb news as well, they need to find a new starting running back. And thankfully, this year's class is absolutely loaded with talent. This year's class will be on display on the Saturday along with the quarterbacks. The guy that I will be keeping my eyes on the most is Caleb Johnson from Iowa. I'm in love with this player as a prospect for the Browns. I'll admit it. He might be one of my favourite prospects overall. I just think he's the perfect running back in a Kevin Stefanski offense. His contact balance is great. He's an extremely patient but smart runner with great vision. He's so good at buying enough time, pardon me, for the holes to open, but then also has, the awareness and vision to know what lane to take. He's explosive. He has great burst, especially in his ability to plant and go when it does come to shooting those holes. He's also got a pretty good frame at 6 foot 225, but it doesn't seem to slow him down or hurt him late in games. He averaged 5.8 yards per carry in the fourth quarter for 2024, so it's not like he's getting gassed in games because of his slightly bigger size, on top of a pretty decent workload with over 240 carries last season. His biggest criticism is his apparent lack of top end speed, which I don't put too much stock into. If he runs a sub 4.5, he might go in the first round, so I'm actually kind of hoping he doesn't. He's also not the best receiver out of the backfield, but so it would be good to see him put some pass catching drills on display this weekend as well. Just a really, really fun player, and as I said, he's one of my favourite prospects for the Browns this year. Really looking forward to seeing what he can do at the Combine this weekend. Omarion Hampton out of North Carolina is another one of the better running back prospects I'll be watching. He has a similar frame to Caleb Johnson at 6 foot and 220 pounds, but he's more of a downhill runner than Johnson is. I love his play style. He's a violent runner that consistently gains extra yards, similar to Chubb in that essence. Even when he's tackled, he's always able to pick up a yard or two extra. He's quick for his size, yet he does show great strength in his rushing ability, as well as his pass blocking. I do think he can rely on his power a bit too much. He's not the most creative runner, which is why I currently have Caleb Johnson ahead of him. But he's still a really, really fun prospect that the Browns should definitely be looking at if he makes it to day 2. Of course, I'll be keeping an eye on the Ohio State boys, Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Both guys could really improve their draft stock this weekend. I expect both of them to test well and look good in their drills, but I think Travion probably has the best chance to light up the athletic drills and testing and truly stamp himself as one of the top running back prospects in this year's draft. Of course, I wouldn't be against either guy at the Browns, but Cam Scatterboo is an interesting one purely because, he was so good for Arizona State in their playoff run last year, but he's a 5'11", 215-pound runner who relies pretty much purely on power at the college level, which won't cut it in the NFL. So it will be interesting to see how he tests and whether he can show that he can offer anything else as a runner. And then finally on the running backs, Ollie Gordon II intrigues me as a day 3, maybe late day 2 guy. And no, it's not just because we share the same name. Considering he's 6'1", 230 pounds, he's got surprisingly good speed. He's got good contact balance and vision and is quite a patient runner, despite his size suggesting he's probably more of a downhill guy, which of course he can do as well. He's shown good potential as a receiver out of the backfield as well in college with 80 career receptions. He was amazing in 2023, award-winning amazing. I think over 1,500 yards rushing, but he did regress in 2024, but how much of that was him regressing versus Oklahoma State as a team regressing? They went from 10 wins in 2023 to just 3 in 2024. He's not the best pass blocker despite his size, and he didn't exactly run the most pro-style offense at Oklahoma State. His biggest question mark for me is probably his overall agility and explosiveness altogether. So really interested to see how he tests at the combine. If he puts out some great times in the agility drills, like the 3 cone and the 40, then that would be massive in improving his draft stock. He does also have a DUI arrest that he'll have to answer for during the interview. So, it could be a make or break weekend for Ollie Gordon. So interesting to see how he gets on. Next up is the offensive line class, another area of need I've talked about during the off-season. I've been sounding the alarm for years regarding, the Browns' needs to address their flailing offensive line. It's been a massive problem for a couple of years now. Stemming since the cracks have been there since 2020 after that year. The whole line needs revamping and they need to heavily invest in it. This year's offensive line class is a bit up and down. The top end talent isn't great compared to previous years, but there is some decent depth overall. They'll be last up on Sunday, so don't hold your breath. But a lot of question marks about, whether some of this tackle class are actually tackles in the NFL. So we'll get a much better idea on, getting a lot of these guys' measurements and, getting a gauge on their athletic ability to see if it can translate in the NFL. Whilst I think, something like height is slightly overblown when it comes to playing tackle, other measurements like, arm length, hand size, and of course agility certainly do matter. Someone like a Will Campbell, who is viewed as, one of the top offensive line prospects. Jack Brentnell that I had on here a couple of weeks ago, I think he had him as his number 1 offensive line prospect. But, he is one of these guys that will have to show that he has the physical measurements and athleticism if he wants to play tackle in the NFL. To be honest, I'm not interested in him or a Kelvin Banks in the first round. No chance. There's just not going to take that reach on either of those guys where the Browns will be picking. But I will be interested in, guys like Josh Simmons, Armand Membu, Gray Zabriel, and I'm going to absolutely butcher his name as I always do, but Erionte Ursay. Ursay or Ursay? I don't know. I'm so bad with names, guys. But excited to see what they can do this weekend and, see whether they can get themselves into a first round consideration with great testing, because, they are certainly guys that I expect the Browns to be targeting in day 2 at offensive line. As I said, there's not much top-end talent in this year's offensive line class, but still intrigued to see what, some of the day 2 guys can do. And who knows, maybe I walk away from the combine, banging the table for one of them at 33, as I was banging the table for, Roger Rodengarten or Kinsley Suamatiea last year at 54. So that's it for the offense for me. I am, of course, going to be keeping my eyes out on guys like tight end Harold Fanning, wide receiver Tez Walker. They're both really, really fun prospects and just interesting guys overall. But, I don't view those positions as big of needs for the Browns as the others I named. Plus, I'll be here all day if I started talking about all the wide receiver prospects. So that's something I'll cover more in kind of the deep dives I do in the lead up to the draft. Defensively, the number one thing I will be looking at this weekend is this defensive line class. It's probably the strongest position group in the draft. So much potential first round talent. Of course, Abdul Carter headlines the class, but as mentioned at the start, he will not be participating in drills, which does give the other guys a great chance to boost their stock. They'll be doing, their drills on Thursday, so we'll get an early look into these guys. And to be honest, is the reason why I rushed this video out, because the defensive line class is so good that I couldn't just skip over it. And I've got a busy day at work on Thursday. I couldn't guarantee I'd be able to get it out in time, so that's why I wanted to get this out. Mason Graham is one of my favourite prospects in this draft. I think he's worthy of a top 5 pick. and he'll solidify that with a good combine. Hell, if he tests really well, he might even put himself into consideration as a top 3 pick, but it's likely he'll probably get pushed out by Carter, Travis Hunter, and a quarterback. He's such a strong anchor in the middle of the line, but also has the ability to play across it. He's an A+ run stopper, but what makes him so exciting as a prospect is his potential to rush the passer. He's shown a great combination of power and finesse when it comes to beating his blocks and generating pressure. Pass rush upside at the defensive tackle position is so valuable in the NFL. Just look at the 2 teams in the past Super Bowl. One had Jalen Carter and the other had Chris Jones. Really excited to see how Graham tests, see how he gets on in his drills. As I said, if he shows the athleticism needed to rush the passer in the NFL at an elite level, then boy, he'll become an even more exciting prospect. Another guy, Shamar Stewart, is someone who could have a massive combine. He's already been climbing the draft boards, and if he tests well, he could solidify himself as a top 10 pick. He's an absolute beast of a man at 6'5", I think over 280 pounds, but he does move really well for his size and has pretty decent bend, which does allow him to play all over the defensive line, even as an edge rusher. As you can imagine, he has incredible power. He bulldozes through offensive linemen with his bull rush. He needs to improve his arsenal of pass rush moves, and he can rely a bit too much on power. His hand usage could also use improvement, and he does also need to improve on converting pressure into sacks. He had just 4.5 sacks in his career, but the potential is there and is definitely someone I would be looking at for the Browns in a trade back scenario. So excited to see how he gets on this weekend. James Pierce out of Tennessee could also help his draft stock with a big combine performance. He was once regarded as a top prospect in this year's draft, but he's kind of slipped down the board a bit after a slightly down year in 2024 and kind of the rise of some of these other guys. He's got good size at 6'5", but he's pretty light at just 243 pounds. So he will need to test well at the combine to get rid of any size concerns. He is incredibly explosive, especially off the line. So I do expect him to do well in the athletic drills, which could go a long way in solidifying himself as a first-round pick. Mike Green out of Marshall is someone who is also interesting. He's got the size, skill, and tape to be a first-rounder, but he's absolutely drenched in off-the-field issues. So he's someone who will actually need a better outing in his interviews than he will in his drills. He'll test well, as he did at the Senior Bowl, I'm sure of it, but teams are going to want answers for, the sexual assault charges he's had. He's someone whose draft stock will entirely depend on his character assessment from teams, and, addressing that starts at the combine for him. So a big weekend for Mike Green, the Marshall standout. Jack Sawyer is someone I'll be hoping can improve his draft stock, of course, with a good combine. And I'll also be keeping my eye on Dion Walker out of Kentucky. 6'7", 340 pounds defensive tackle who can actually move pretty well on tape, and is a monster at swallowing up double teams. So interested to see how he tests as a potential later day 2 pick. If he can move as well as he seems to move on tape, then the intrigue is certainly going to go up with him. Finally, on defense for me is the safeties. I've said for a couple of weeks now that I think this is a wild card pick for the Browns that could come a lot higher than expected. Even before the team cut Thornhill, the writing was on the wall. We all knew it was coming. I've made it clear now that I'm fed up of trying to address the safety position with the veteran free agent route. It didn't work with John Johnson, and it didn't work with Juan Thornhill. let's draft and develop a guy. You know, the safeties will be on display on Friday, so we won't have to wait too long. Malachi Starks has a chance to, solidify himself as a top 15 to top 10 pick this weekend. You know, arguably one of the better players in this draft when you don't factor in position. He has elite speed and he is excellent in coverage. Probably an unlikely target for the Browns, seeing as where they're picking, but we'll be interested to see how he gets on. Nick Amawari is someone who I'm really, I think I'm the most intrigued by. Almost a unicorn type build at safety at 6'3", 225 pounds, but similar to Kyle Hamilton, he's got great speed and agility, as well as good coverage ability for his size. Really interested to see how he tests. Great performance from him could easily catapult himself into the first round for sure. Guys I will have my eyes on as maybe you could say more realistic targets for the Browns at safety are Xavier Watts out of Notre Dame, Andrew Makuba out of Texas, and Kevin Winston from Penn State. All three, I think, could fill that that safety role next to Delpit, and they're all quick enough, good enough in coverage to be effective at it. So interested to see how those guys tests and how they stack up against each other. Now, if the Browns traded Denzel Ward, I'd talk about the corners, but they're not going to. So I'm not going to bore you guys talking about day 3 corner prospects. I'll maybe do a dive on a couple of the top guys leading up to the draft just in case, but for now I'm only going to mention Travis Hunter, because while some might view him as a receiver, he is participating at the combine as a corner. I do think that is a smart move from him. The wide receiver drills aren't great, and they don't really tell you that much. We know he can play receiver in the NFL, so instead I think he has a better chance to display his athleticism in the corner drills, which are just better suited for doing so, in my opinion. If he goes and lights up those drills and shows that he's the best athlete in the class, he'll potentially get himself drafted a spot or two higher, but let's face it, he's going to go top 5 regardless. So it is actually kind of surprising that he is participating in any of the drills this weekend. But I'm happy he is, because he's going to be a lot of fun to watch this weekend, that is for sure. But that's my thoughts on the combine and what I think the Browns will be looking at. As I said at the start, I will do a deeper dive into these prospects, as we build up to the draft in April. But for now, just wanted to touch on the combine and highlight, what position groups, players in particular, I'm keeping my eye on in Indianapolis this weekend. It's always great to see all the interviews and the content that come out of a weekend like the NFL combine, from the players, from the teams themselves. As fans, we get to see guys like Andrew Berry in front of a mic for the first time in a while, so always great insight for us guys. Really looking forward to it. I'll of course touch on any news or highlights that happen over the weekend, and we'll break down the combine once the festivities are over. But one last thing I will just say is we gotta stop with the 40-yard dash, guys. Like I just don't care. There's not many drills that are a worse indicator of how a player will translate to the NFL. Yes, on the base level, we don't want to see someone go and run a 4.8, but just because someone ran a 4.31 versus a 4.38 doesn't mean we should then start changing our draft boards. So let's just cool down on the 40-yard draft, the 40 yards dashes this year, guys. But that would do it for me. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if I only get to talk to one fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing weekend, rest of the week. Enjoy the combine, but most importantly, go Browns.